Hey folks, this is our dual credit 1302 course, and today it is April the 12th, and we are going to finish up our unit on industrialization and sectionalism in early history. And then you need to make sure that you study for the next test. The next test is on Wednesday, and I will update information where you can find that. Yeah,
Is mine gonna be on paper?
maybe.
Okay.
We'll
Just
see.
figuring that out. I
And
remembered last time.
I'm going to try to remember this time. And so it's going to pick up where we left off on your last test. So, which was your last test? Did they have questions on Andrew Jackson? I don't remember
One
Frank.
question.
Yes,
I don't remember Frank. Are you sure?
yes.
Okay, I'll go back and double check just to make sure. But I'm trying to remember if he was part of the second exam or not. Like my memory is failing.
Pretty sure.
Pretty sure. All right, that's okay.
82%. 82.3.
82.3.
No, you were saying.
Yeah, please don't forget, I posted a lot of my lecture material on the Google Classroom. Pretty fine. So we left off last time, we were talking about the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793. And so, yeah, this really blew up the plantation economy in the South, made cotton hugely successful as far as profits go. Remember, I told you some historians say around 90% of the Southern economy revolved in some way or another around cotton. If you're making money, I'm not talking about subsistence farming, you're just growing what you need to live. Like everything from the manufacturing, the reasons you would have boats and roads, and all kinds of things. It all tied, the tax money, it all tied back to cotton. You know, that's just crazy. So you can see there was a huge economic interest in the South regarding protecting the cotton industry. Other advancements in the industry, interchangeable parts allowed relatively unskilled craftsmen to repair and build complicated devices. And so you see in the background, I have a firearm back there. And so no longer do you need to have gunsmiths necessarily to create a rifle. You can now have, if it breaks, you don't have to take it to a very skilled blacksmith to have it fixed, though you could still. Instead, you could order interchangeable parts that are of the right measurement to fix that part and put it back together. I mean, you know, stuff breaks nowadays. We still have this blessing where if something breaks, you can get the right kind of screw maybe to fix it, especially when it comes to homes and stuff like that. You can order the kind of pipes you might need.
I'm so glad we could interchange parts of cars.
Oh yeah, cars, automobiles. If those things were handcrafted somehow, like that would just be crazy. It would be really crazy. I mean, everyone has to change at least even the simple parts of their vehicles every now and again. Whether it just look at windshield wipers, like everybody's got to change those out. They're pretty simple. It's an interchangeable part in modern terms. So I think we already mentioned this, but telegraphs allowed instant communications across the country. Mail carriers were still a really big deal, but the telegraph could allow for relatively instantaneous communication. And so this was a very revolutionary thing. This is going to help out armies and governments and businesses and just families be able to connect. Canals were dug and roads were laid so that greater ease of travel and commerce helped advance the country. We discussed this quite a bit earlier when we were talking about the early formation of the United States. So even the first canal that connected, I think it was New York to the Great Lakes. The mechanical reaper allowed farmers to greatly increase the amount of crops obtained during times of harvest. So that's the thing about technology. Technology is essentially a tool to make it work. Well, one of the reasons that we do this is labor. And so a mechanical reaper, you can think of it as like an early kind of tractor. It saves where you don't need as many people to do work, such as reaping, such as cutting down crops, without destroying. And then we're going to see that technology will advance and be able to take away some of the demand for having agricultural field hands and labor, which is one of the main reasons why people wanted to keep slavery. Steamboats sailed up and down all major rivers in America for travel, shipping, and entertainment. We talked about that last time. It could be a way for people to safely travel up and down the river, ship their goods, but also it was like a traveling, like little Las Vegas. The factory system allowed for faster, cheaper production and contributed to the urbanization in the North. So we're talking about the growth of the factory systems in England and America in our world history course for 10th grade. And so we're seeing that this is a massive lifestyle change for a lot of people. To go from agriculture, especially in ancient agricultural society, like peasantry in Europe, to go to the factory system was seen as traumatic. So instead of living according to like the seasons and with your community and doing the same thing that your ancestors beyond memory did, now all of a sudden you're in a cramped quarters in a city, surrounded by strangers, working for money, and you don't quite know what to do with that money, but you don't trust anyone around you. You're making purchases that probably aren't very good for your health. Like in England, when they started in the industrial age, so many people moved into the cities, and they're essentially like the descendants of serfs. And now that they're making money, they're like, well, what do I do with it? Well, they're trading with the rest of the world, and they're getting all these cool things, but they're also getting bad things. And so the life expectancy of early industrial workers in England dropped below medieval levels. Because what were people doing? It was kind of like kids in the candy store. They were just eating their calories were coming mostly from sugar and gin, and they were smoking a lot. They were just dying left and right. So, in fact, studies show that after a lot of enslaved people were freed after the Civil War, they're going to find that a lot of these newly freedmen aren't going to know what to do with their freedom. And so people like Booker T. Washington, a former slave, is going to write about his fellow slaves and be like, wow, I'm looking around and they don't know what to do with freedom. So they get a little bit of money and they'll just buy stuff that doesn't make sense, and like he would complain they just spent most of their money on drinking now that they could do whatever they want to. Or you might get your paycheck and you'll see something cool like a piano and you'll buy it, but you don't know how to play a piano, and so you give up. And so you just start eating off of it like a table until it's ruined. It's just like, what do you do when you have freedom all of a sudden? You don't know what to do with it. I mean, they say that's one of the differences between old money families and new money families, right? So like a new money family, like a classic example would be like Elvis. You get super rich and he buys all this ostentatious stuff and he can really blow money and he doesn't care. Whereas like an old money family who's inherited the money down generations, they kind of they don't spend money very often. They try not to show off. And, there's like a cultural thing that goes with it from what I understand. All right. So off that tangent, effects of industrialization. Due to transportation problems, remember this is the North. This is the North. There's not a lot of industry in the South. There's not a lot of factories and manufacturing going on down there. And we're going to talk about that more when we talk about Civil War, because it's just going to be like a little ant compared to the North as far as it goes. Due to transportation problems, factory workers had to live in tightly packed slums near their places of work. So the cities were often organic. What I mean by that is they weren't planned. Somebody wants to open a factory and see a spot on the side of the river that looked pretty good for boats coming in and out of, so he'd buy it. Well, he needs workers. He's not concerned where the workers live, just come and work. So what would they do? Within visual range of that factory that's probably pumping out a lot of coal smoke, people will build up apartments. To make the most money out of your apartment, you don't rent out a room to one family, you rent it out to seven. And so, but the city doesn't really have a lot of government functions. So there's not any sewers working. The roads are like little dirt roads. Somebody like slaughters a hog or a chicken, they just dump the guts out in front of the apartment. So this is a place full of disease and just like crime and things like that. Children with no school, running around while their parents worked. So there's like really chaos in a lot of these cities at first. Immigration fueled the demand for new. People who are already here didn't want to work in these jobs. They saw these filthy places and they didn't want to do the same thing for 12 hours on end, 6 days a week. And they were like, forget that. And so people were imported. In 1820 to 1830, more than 151,000 people migrated to the U.S. It rose to 1.5 million between 1840 and 1850. So that's a huge increase from this one decade. Then you skip one and go on over. Nearly half of them were from Ireland. The Irish sought to escape the potato blight of 1841, which led to massive starvation. So the potato blight, it's one of the problems you come across whenever you have like a mono agricultural source of nutrition. So the Irish, the soil is rather rocky in a lot of areas, especially places where the poor could live. And so things that are traditional European parts of their diet, like wheat and barley and oats, don't grow well there. But potatoes did. And potatoes were something that came from the New World. And the Irish found, wow, this grows very well here. It's an easy source of nutrition. So their population grew with that new source of nutrition. And so that was great. In fact, the Irish tended to be healthier during this time than people in England because they ate this healthier source of nutrition instead of, like I was telling you, blowing it off on sugar and gin and stuff like that, right? So, but the potato blight was a sort of fungus that would get into the potato while it was still in the ground and just turn it into like this inedible mush. And so this spread like wildfire. And since their source of calories was mostly from this, it was devastating. In England, the people who hated the Irish decided to just let them starve. They had offered no aid. They restricted their trade. And so a lot of Irish people were literally starving. And so many of them fled here. The second largest demographic to migrate were the Germans. Both faced difficulties in language and were seen as outsiders because they were mostly Catholic. So you gotta remember, it's mostly English-speaking Protestant Americans here. And so a lot of these people were religious dissenters from the government that they come from. And, a lot of people from Ireland spoke Gaelic, especially if they were like from the country. And the Germans spoke German. And so it was a big deal, pickle. And of course, this is long before we have, what we would call like the unification of Germany as well. So that hadn't even happened yet. All right, social reforms in the early 19th century. So we have all these things happening, like demographic changes up north, slavery in the South, industry, manufacturing, all these things. We're going to have certain ideas spread throughout, like especially we're going to talk about the idea of people's rights, like women's rights, but also the rights of enslaved people, right? So David Thoreau, author who refused to pay taxes because he did not wish to support slavery or the war in Mexico, wrote his essay, Civil Disobedience, which would later influence Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, so he was kind of like an isolated guy a lot of his life. He would live in this cabin, this little shed out in the woods, and just kind of like to sit there and think about nature and stuff like that. But he was very big on the idea of civil disobedience, non-violent protesting of something you see as evil, and through tax evasion, you're not supporting a system that you see as evil, right? And so this is going to influence Martin Luther King Jr., like I said. Frederick Douglass is the guy whose picture is in the background. Former slave who personally led the abolitionist movement in the U.S. He was also an accomplished orator and writer. He was very good. He's very good. His autobiography, very good work, where he'd show and tell his story about being this young enslaved man who was in many ways more lucky than a lot of the other slaves around him. He's going to get sold off to what I thought at first was a very nice couple, and the wife was trying to teach him how to read, but she's going to stop doing that because she's going to be embarrassed by her husband. He's going to tell her, "You're not supposed to do that." So she'll be very ashamed and then start abusing him. He's eventually going to run away and get his freedom after he learns a few trades and he grows up. He's going to talk about how they saw him as too smart when he was young, so they wanted to break him. So they sent him to a man who was well known for breaking young men to be better slaves, basically to kill their hope, you know. And so he talks about all these things going on in his mind and in his heart while he's living through this. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, key leader in the 19th century women's suffrage movement. So women don't have the right to vote yet. During this time period, the women's suffrage movement was largely connected with the anti-slavery movement. They saw that these two things could go hand in hand. Unfortunately, though, after the Civil War, they're going to divorce from one another because ex-male slaves will get the right to vote, but women won't. And so they're going to see this as kind of like, what? You know, like an insult. So back to Stanton. She was also active in abolitionist temperance movement. So temperance was a weird thing. So like I was talking about social movements, right? So like anti-slavery is a social movement. Women's rights to vote is a social movement. Workers' rights is a social movement. But one that both the North and the South could agree on was the temperance movement. And that is getting rid of alcohol, demon rum. This is one of those things because in the South, you had a lot of people who were good churchgoers. They're like, well, you know, getting drunk is a sin. And up north, you know, we had bad problems with like the saloons and stuff like that, or where, you know, men would go work. And after work, they go to the bar. Next thing you know, they come home with no money and maybe even a venereal disease. And so that was not good. Susan B. Anthony started in the temperance movement and then worked towards women's suffrage. She also fought for women's property rights and equal pay. So, yeah, in the early colonies, women didn't have a lot of rights as far as property went. Very often they had to have a male relative that could act as their dad, essentially, even though they might have been grown or have earned their money and their property with their own hands. And so a lot of this idea is going to stick around for some time. All right. Whoa, went too far. All right. The abolitionist movement. So here I have some dates. You don't have to memorize the dates, but at least know the order of events. Order is important. That's why dates are important. Dates aren't important because of a number. It's to show cause and effect. So you know why something happened. Well, it happened after this, so maybe there's a connection. And after that, something else happened. So maybe there's a connection between those two things. So what we're seeing here is the connection and the growth of the idea of freeing enslaved people. It's not a wildly popular thing, and it's going to become bigger and bigger as time goes on. From the 1700s to 1804, many religious leaders, especially Quakers, publicly denounced slavery. Remember, Quakers were totally totally different from most people. Like women were on a completely even playing field to the Quaker, and they were 100% anti-violence, even for self-defense. And so, so they were definitely anti-slavery. But in 1804, all states north of Pennsylvania had outlawed slavery. So we see that really far up north, that you see a lot of it, it's already gone. They're like, now some of it's kind of like, well, hardly anybody has any slaves anyways. So the people who were pro-slavery were kind of a minority. But nobody really wanted to do anything about the southern states. They're like, oh, that's their business. We're going to leave them alone. 1807, Congress banned the importation of African people for slaves. And so this is something that was hammered out during the Constitutional Convention, if I remember correctly. They're like, okay, we want to legalize slaves, but we'll at least ban the importation. Why, you might say? Well, part of it has to do with pressure from England. In England during this time, they're starting to ratchet down on the international slave trade because they're really fed up with it. They're like, we need to stop this. Maybe we shouldn't have done it. But also, slaves who have been imported directly from Africa, how were they captured? In battle. So these were warriors. They didn't want to bring African warriors and generals in because they had seen that there had been slave revolts from former warriors who don't necessarily like having people like torture them and tell them what to do. And so they were scared of bringing these folks in. But some folks were also hoping this might slow down the system. It didn't. One of the unique things about slavery in the United States of America is, unlike a lot of places, they were able to breed people. Other places that had slavery, that wasn't done very successfully. Usually the enslaved people interbreed with the locals, and then slavery would vanish, or they would just die. But in the South, it was different. In 1817, American Colonization Society helped establish Liberia, Africa. It's on the western side of Africa, northwestern. Not north, but kind of like up there, as a nation of former slaves to live. But it wasn't very popular. Remember, right, even like a lot of abolitionists at this time were really on board with this. They're like, look, if you remember, I told you Thomas Jefferson in his personal writings said he didn't like slavery, even though he owned slaves. But he thought that if you freed slaves, they would hate the country that enslaved them, right? A lot of people agreed with that. And a lot of people might not have liked slavery, but that didn't mean they liked black people. And so they thought it would have been better to purchase people's freedom, teach them a bit more about self-sufficiency and law and Christianity, and just have them make their own country in Africa. So they saw this as kind of like a missionary thing as well. It wasn't successful. I mean, Liberia will be founded, but a lot of those early colonists were just slaughtered, if I remember right, by disease and the locals and things like that. But it is going to be a country founded by slaves. So is Haiti. Haiti was actually founded from a slave revolt that was successful. 1820, 1840, abolitionists grew. William Lloyd Garrison published a newspaper called The Liberator and organized the New England Anti-Slavery Society. And this is where we see abolitionism get radical. And they start moving on, like William Lloyd Garrison, he is so mad about slavery. He literally goes into public and calls America evil for having slavery. And he'll go as far as like burn the Constitution and the U.S. flag in public. So he made a lot of enemies. But a lot of people were attracted to that. So so you see that there are these periods of time where we have just radicalism, where people are just like, well, we just need to destroy America altogether. And here we have a bit of that. And you can still see things like that happen today. 1850, the Underground Railroad began to help slaves escape the South to safe places in the North. Harriet Tubman personally helped hundreds of such people. And yeah, so so you would have these safe houses, right, where these people would go and hide out, and they would get guidance to move further up north. Sometimes you'd have people like Tubman who would just drive a wagon and hide people in the back of the wagon. And this is going to really, really anger a lot of Southerners because they're going to see the Underground Railroad as this big conspiracy that all of the North is in on. And they're going to say, the North's got to stop this. In fact, the North is going to have to help us capture slaves and bring it back. And we're going to see that is going to make the North really mad too. So both sides are really getting on each other's nerves here. Whoop. Hey, all right. Oh, wait, I thought that was the last one. Okay. So the abolitionist movement continued. With the Compromise of 1850 came the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So remember, the Compromise of 1850 was about making new territories into new states. And it was like, okay, well, kind of keep it even, half slave, half free, and this will keep the nation together. We're not really going to assess the whole question of slavery, but at least we'll still be together for a bit more. But the Fugitive Slave Act, this law made Northerners have to turn in slaves caught in the North. So this meant you might have thought that slavery was a Southern thing and you could keep your hands free of it. Not anymore. Now, if you find out somebody is an escaped slave, by law, you must turn them in or you are a criminal. So this made innocent people who thought they weren't even part of the thing into criminals, or they had to help. So made a lot of Northerners mad. Also, set up a bounty on slaves who were caught. And the bounty was like this. So it was something like, if you caught a slave, you got $20. But if you found somebody who was legally a freedman, like black, but not in the, you only got 10. Well, this led to a lot of corruption to where these bounty hunters, whenever they found any black person, even if they had papers saying they were free, they just kind of, threw away the papers, dragged them back south and made money. So this drove many Northerners towards abolition. Now, as far as popular thought goes, Harriet Beecher Stowe, 1853, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, she was from up north, and the story goes she never even met a slave, but she wrote this moving work about this old enslaved gentleman, and it really drove a lot of people against slavery. Even the Queen of England loved this book. It was an international bestseller. It became #1 within like a couple of months. It showed the terrible realities of slavery and brought in more abolitionists. Like it was right there, right under the Bible, like almost immediately. People were like eating this thing up. And it drove a lot of people to think, whoa, maybe it's bad in the South. Maybe they don't quite understand just how bad it is. This is going to lead to something called the Free Soil Party, because slavery and anti-slavery are going to become the two biggest issues of the day. Not just tariffs anymore, or not just expansion out west with Manifest Destiny. It's about slave or anti-slave, which many free Whigs, including Martin Van Buren, gravitated towards. Free soil, free speech, free labor, free men was their slogan. This party would soon be absorbed by the Republican Party. Remember, the Whigs had been doing it really bad for a while. The Democrat Party had been largely in charge of the presidency, but due to sectionalism, North and South, they were kind of evenly split in the legislature. And so this kept people happy. They're like, okay. You won't make too many laws we won't like. We won't make too many laws you don't like, because we have to compromise with each other. We have to work with each other. We're split. So we can't just go with the things we really, really want. So, but yeah, the Republican Party is going to be like this mix of all kinds of things put together. It's going to be a successful third party in a sense. Up there, I put Perry, third Republican Perry.
Program settings. I've run over Tom's County.
It's on. I have a copy of it somewhere. I really should. I don't know. I don't know. Like I'm really, whenever it's fiction, I'm really super picky. But when it's nonfiction, I'm like, oh, it's history. I'll just read it. But I don't know. All right. Hey, here. All right. So here's the last one of the unit. Sectionalism points to war. So if you remember, we see that things had almost got violent all the way back to Andrew Jackson. But now it will. So sectionalism, concern for regional needs and interests. And here's some examples of that. So I've been bringing up this term. Let's see. So one was the Missouri Compromise. Remember, all three of these have to do with free or slave states. So it has to do with political power. Yeah, it has to do with slavery. It has to do with money. And it also has to do with pride. So, Missouri Compromise. Missouri entered the Union as a slavery state as long as Maine could enter as a free state. Remember, we see this. We talked about this. This was just a Band-Aid, though. It didn't address the issue. Also, that north of the 3630 parallel should choose those states would be free, and those who are south could be slave. This applied only to Louisiana Purchase. So we see, but guess what? You know full and well we take in land west of the Louisiana Purchase. So every time we add land, the question comes back up. And so who knows? Maybe if we would have stopped there, it wouldn't happen. But there was a whole Mexican-American War. So, Compromise of 1850. California admitted as a free state. Passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. We just talked about that. Abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Yeah, just a few houses down from the White House was this little prison building where they used to auction off slaves. And so they'd bring these people in and they would cram them in there and they would feed them a little bit and clean them up. And right there on the side of the street, you would have these barkers just there auctioning off humans. And so this was a big embarrassment to a lot of U.S. diplomats because we would bring in officials and ambassadors. And the first thing we're like, since their country didn't do anything, I was like, wow, what's that smell? And it smelled awful because they just had these people with no toilets or anything. And they'd be like, can I go see the slave auctions? What does a slave look like? And so this was like a big embarrassment. It was like something that people were just like, why are people proud of this? Like, why are we the only modern country that still does this? So Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, law passed by Congress that allowed residents of Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide whether to allow slavery within their borders. And they call this popular sovereignty. So they were like, we're going to put it up to the vote. We're going to let in the most democratic way possible. We're going to let these territories, when they decide to become states, vote whether they're going to be slave or free. And so what's going to happen is that people who live in a territory aren't a citizen of that territory. You're just someone who lives there. And so you're going to have people from surrounding regions flood into Kansas and Nebraska to vote whether it's slave or free, because they see it's going to affect their home. And so when you have these people come in, you'll have people come in from the South to vote for that, say Kansas will be pro-slave, but then you have people from the North come into Kansas because they want to cast a ballot saying it's going to be free. Well, these people are going to meet up with each other and murder one another. This is going to be something we're going to talk about in the next unit. There's going to be gunfights. There's going to be murders of families, all kinds of things. It's going to be really ugly, where you're going to have people are going to start having horrible fighting before war breaks out. You're going to see private citizens go out of their way as vigilantes for one side or another. And so the nation is getting more and more violent. We're not talking about things. We're just saying like the most abrasive, abusive things possible, and then they're turning to weapons. And so that's where we're going to end off. So this material will be testable. So make sure you study, and I'll post the test on Wednesday. See ya.
Bye, Mr. White. No.